Hello, this is the fourth of the four short lectures for week 4 of HS 117 at Union Theological Seminary. And this week, I am going to talk about something I'm calling imagining the other. I'll be discussing a little bit of two different things. One is how Europeans pictured the Americas, particularly I'll be looking at some English examples. How did they imagine the Americas? How did they make sense of the Americas? And I also am going to be saying just a very little bit about the origins of the Atlantic slave trade and its implications for Christianity. So a couple of key developments in the 16th century to review. You know this already. The interest in the Americas expanded across Europe. The Atlantic slave trade emerged, by which I mean the traffic in slaves from Africa to European colonies in the America. The Reformation changed the politics, the culture of Europe, adding a religious element to rivalries among European powers, and also kind of ending any sense that of Christianity as a kind of unified shared religious identity in Europe. And these developments had important implications, both for theological anthropology, and also, though I won't say as much about this, for eschatology, so for the theological view of, what human beings are, who we are, how we make sense of human life, and for where we think the world is going, where we think the history of the world is pointed. So as accounts of the Americas spread across Europe, interest in colonization spread as well. We know that this process began with the Portuguese and the Spanish, but French, English, Dutch, Danish colonization projects emerged. Even some small projects coming from other countries. Most of these colonization projects were funded by private joint stock companies with government permission. So carrying them out required attracting investors. And so to attract investors, advocates of colonization used the new technology of printing to make their case. And in promoting American colonization, the promoters had a mix of motivations. Some were religious and some were commercial. And sometimes it was hard to separate the two. One of the figures I'd like to mention is Richard Hakluyt, who lived in the late 16th century and the early 17th. He was a geographer and a Protestant clergyman. This is an image of him in a stained glass window in Bristol Cathedral. He produced a vast number of English language texts promoting exploration and colonization. And still today, his publications are a major source of historical information about early English voyages to the Americas. And a document that you have in the readings for this week is his Discourse of Western Planting. This was a private report that he presented to Queen Elizabeth. It wasn't actually published until 1877, but it's now considered a seminal document of Elizabethan expansion. The excerpt that you've been assigned is essentially the table of contents and the first chapter. So it's written with wild Elizabethan spelling, but to the extent you can decipher it, and it's the project of deciphering it is kind of fun. You can see both what he intended to cover throughout the document, and you can read a section of it in more detail. And this, what I hope you'll see in this document is the confluence of religious and commercial motivations. Why did Hakluyt think it was important to, for the English to establish colonies in the Americas? It was both because of the advantage he saw to the English economy, but also because of a sense that converting the natives, the native people, converting the native people of the Americas was part of, somehow part of God's, what God called the English nation to do. And this is the first page of his most famous book, Diverse Voyages Touching the Discovery of America and the Islands Adjacent. I also want to mention Thomas Harriot, part of the same circle as Hakluyt. Like Hakluyt, he was a geographer, a Protestant clergyman, and a producer of the publications advertising the Americas. He actually learned the Algonquian language from 2 Virginia Indians, and he accompanied Francis Drake to Virginia in 1585. And in Harriot, we have a really good example of the contradictory images that were produced of the Americas and their people. In the works of Hakluyt and Harriot, but also other Europeans who tried to represent America to European audiences, there are a couple of recurring patterns. One is a pattern of a sense of wonder or the marvelous that included both delight, pleasure, and fear. Fear of the monstrous, fear of the unknown. And the European narratives frequently go very quickly back and forth between these 2 iterations of the marvelous. They shared a contradictory view of Native Americans, on the one hand as peaceable, easily converted to Christianity, but also as dangerous pagans. And these 2 views coexisted in their rhetoric side by side. And you also see them attempting to make sense of this so-called new world, this territory that was new to them, in light of the Bible. And I think you see this a bit more in Protestant voices than in Catholic ones, trying to figure out, what is this new place? What is this land? Is it the Garden of Eden? Is it the Promised Land? Is it, what is it? And we talked a little bit about Theodore DeBry in a previous week. I'm going to show you a couple of DeBry's illustrations of one of Harriot's books. And these show you, I think, the contrast. This is something that Karen Ordall Cooperman has written about. This first image purports to show a Native American village in Virginia. And here you see the image of America as a garden and its inhabitants as peaceful and civilized. This image represents America as a very, as a pleasant and fruitful place, amenable to European exploitation. But then in the very same book, you also see this image of a Native American dance. And here you see the indigenous people of Virginia represented in a way it calculated to strike Europeans as different, as other, as frightening. So sometimes you saw these, sometimes just side by side, you would see these images of commonality, similarity, and these images of a fundamental difference. I also want to briefly talk about the origins of the Atlantic slave trade. Now, slavery did not begin with the Atlantic slave trade. In Europe, slavery had peaked during the Roman Empire and it had never entirely disappeared from European society. In the 1440s, there was an uptick as the Portuguese began shipping African slaves to Europe, mostly to work as domestic servants. As sugar production emerged, especially in the Atlantic islands like the Canaries and Cape Verde, sugar production created the conditions for increased traffic in slaves. There was a need for, or a perceived need, I should say, for a greatly increased amount of labor in the production of sugar. And there was a great market for sugar in Europe, so this industry was very profitable. And so in the Atlantic islands, the plantation economy began to emerge in the 15th century. And by the 16th century, this plantation economy centered around sugar production had spread to the Caribbean. The first enslaved Africans that Europeans transported to the Americas were from the Iberian Peninsula. They were people of African descent who had been acculturated and Christianized by living in Spain and Portugal for some time. But the first direct shipment of enslaved people from Africa to the Americas was in the 1530s. We'll have a lot more to say about slavery and the slave trade in the weeks to come, but just a couple of implications to keep in mind. For Europeans, the slave trade prompted them to ask, or in a lot of cases avoid, questions of theological anthropology. They ask questions like, are all people essentially related? Did we all descend from Adam and Eve? Who is capable of becoming a Christian? Are all people equally able to be saved? What does it mean to be a Christian? Is that a religious identity or an ethnic or racial or cultural identity? And in the coming weeks, you'll see some of how that plays out. The other thing that's very important is a rise of distinctive Black Christianities in the Americas that combined some elements of African religious tradition that survived the Middle Passage and survived slavery with elements of European Christianity. And again, that's something we'll say much more about in the weeks to come, but I just wanted to highlight it today. Thank you, and I look forward to talking with you all soon.